The skyline tore open with the sound of metal and bone, a convoy of ships spitting fire into a city that did not expect gods to arrive with orders. I landed on the avenue because landing was what you do when the air itself refuses to obey. And the first thing I saw was a man in red breaking a road in half with a single swing and not caring who watched. They called him Omni-Man, and the others moved like living wrecking balls. Their punches were uncomplicated statements, and their triumph was measured in rubble. I did not come to protect anyone. I came because a challenge announced itself with enough arrogance to deserve correction, and the way the Viltrumites fought made my blood itch for a real opponent. They struck like conquerors who forgot how to craft a blade, and that contempt fed me in a way the quiet of my world never had. This is only the beginning. The rest of this place has teeth, and every tooth is sharpening. You need to hear what follows, and if you want the whole escalation laid bare, subscribe now. This will not stay a skirmish, and once the Viltrumites learn what true pride looks like, the consequences will outlast your comfort. I arrived because something in the sky wanted to be louder than it had any right to be, and that kind of arrogance is an invitation I rarely refuse. The convoy they sent through the city looked less like an army and more like a confession, men who thought destruction was an acceptable opening line. And the one in red who split the avenue with a single swing announced himself without ceremony. Omni-Man, spine of their pride, moving with the blunt efficiency of a conqueror. I watched from above, letting the heat of their presence wash over me like a reminder that the universe contains competition worth my time, and I judged them before they knew I had arrived because pride teaches you to size an enemy in a breath. The way they hit the city was honest and ugly, and that particular sort of ugliness made my hands itch for something clean. A single opponent to test strength against, not a parade of wreckage. He noticed me before I chose to land because Viltrumites are built to find other threats the way predators find noise, and I let him speak first because there is value in hearing an enemy introduce himself. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, did not roar or charge. He loomed with a gentleman's calm that tried to dress conquest as protocol, telling me in clipped, measured language that the planet, the people, and his mission were considerations he preferred to solve without additional blood. His tone carried the sort of diplomatic dominance men use when they expect others to accept a hierarchy without question, and that posture baited my contempt immediately. I do not bow to speeches dressed as orders. I answered with a position and a look, not with politeness, because courtesy in the face of assumed superiority is a weakness I do not afford. He took my silence as curiosity and softened, which was his first mistake. I tested him in base form because spectacle is for children, and because a true warrior measures reaction at the edge of discomfort, not at the top of power. I let a gust of Kai shear the air near his shoulder, a small, precise irritation meant to determine how quickly their shores would hold. He shifted, a micro-adjustment that spoke of conditioning more than of finesse, and then he smiled almost apologetically and asked again who I was. There was a moment of tactical assessment in that smile, like a predatory machine blinking to confirm a new input, and I used it to move faster than he expected, a jab at distance, a burst across a lane, an open-handed strike aimed to test bone and resolve rather than to kill. He took the hit in a way that made my teeth clench with both irritation and respect. The man did not break, he merely rebalanced, and that recalibration told me why the Viltrumites survived where others crumbled. The others nearby misread the exchange as the start of a full fight rather than the measurement it was, and one of their number intervened with the bluntness of habit. A Viltrumite soldier I will not flatter with a name he has not earned, who slammed the pavement double-wide to prove force, is the primary argument. His blow toppled a tram support, and the resulting collapse turned a street into chaos that could not be unmade by apologies. The arc of metal sheared through a market stall, and through people who had trusted the day would end like any other. I do not claim to be tender, but I do not show pleasure in collateral ruin, and seeing the way they used bluntness as method stirred something in me like acid. Omni-Man moved without losing his composure, catching falling concrete with a single arm and steering debris away from a school that had not yet had time to understand what was happening. My strike came in anger then, not because of their strength but because of their carelessness, and anger is not foreign to me. It is muscle memory. I launched properly, a controlled series of blows that emphasized speed, misdirection, and the sort of cumulative damage training gives you when you expect a fight to be an art, not a demolition, and it landed against the Viltrumite who had thrown the tram support. The impact did not send him flying like an unmannerly clown. He absorbed it, rolled it, and returned force with a durability that made me frown. That durability is not the same as technique. They endure where I strike with intent, and endurance is useful but blunt. Omni-Man stepped between us with the deliberate weight of an arbiter, and said, as if offering a courtesy, that their mission did not include unnecessary escalation, and that they preferred to avoid a battle that would complicate matters for everyone. I responded with contempt because diplomacy that presumes consent is an insult, and my answer was to widen my stance and make no motion toward retreat. He read me clearly enough, his curiosity folding into tactical assessment as he scanned for meaning in my posture, and in the way my energy pulsed without announcement. For a moment he considered negotiation as a strategy, offering words about territory and purpose and the possibility of walking away with dignity preserved on both sides, and I let him speak, because it is instructive to see how a man imagines control will look when dressed up as civility. His offer was not sincere in the way of men who hold power and choose pacification. It was a dominance test lined with courtesy, and I spat on the lining by answering with motion instead of rhetoric. The first real escalation, and the irreversible consequence that will not be undone with apologies, came when another Viltrumite, watching what they interpreted as my threat to their ranks, reacted in the only language they trusted: overwhelming force. He grabbed a van and hurled it through a block as a warning, the vehicle punching through concrete and bringing down wiring that sparked into a line of domestic gas. The gas found an ignition in debris and blossomed into a fire that did not care about the fine points of diplomacy, and by the time Omniman had steered falling beams away from the worst of it, the city had given the day a new scar. Soldiers on the ground called for military response as sirens translated panic into orders, and satellites began marking the coordinates with NATO interest, while the Viltrumites muttered about rogue aliens and assets to be valued. I watched all of it with the sort of calm that is offensive to men who thrive on noise, and I understood the chain before it finished forming. My presence, their blunt counter, infrastructure damaged beyond immediate repair, governments waking up to a threat they did not want measured in heroics. Omniman's face shifted from curiosity to concern then, not because he had underestimated me. He had not. But because he was seeing how fragile human frameworks are when someone like us refuses to cooperate with their neat calculations. He stepped back a fraction, posture changing from arbiter to assessor, and I grinned because retreat is an admission I prefer to collect from others, not to prod into being. The city was burning in a new pattern now, and the gears of escalation were already turning. By the time the first military drones arrived over the river, Omni-Man had already stopped pretending this would resolve itself through tone and posture. He repositioned with the efficiency of someone who had fought wars across systems, angling his body between me and the densest clusters of civilians in a way that suggested strategy rather than compassion. I recognized the calculation immediately because it mirrored something older than this planet: the instinct to isolate a superior threat from assets you intend to preserve. He was no longer curious, he was assessing outcomes. I moved first, not because I was impatient but because allowing him the initiative would have suggested parity, and I do not offer that gift lightly. My strike came at an angle that tested not only his durability but his timing, a feint that opened his guard along a vector most brutes forget to protect. He corrected mid-motion with a torque adjustment that spoke of real battlefield experience, absorbing the impact across his shoulder and returning a counter that cracked the air with the blunt finality of a meteor. The difference between us was immediate and instructive. His force was enormous, but it lacked the layered precision that turned strength into inevitability. Another Viltrumite joined him without invitation, interpreting my refusal to retreat as an escalation that demanded reinforcement rather than negotiation. Their formation was crude but effective in its simplicity, one driving forward while the other flanked to compress my movement into a predictable corridor. I let them believe the trap would hold, stepping into the pressure long enough to measure their coordination before breaking through with a burst of speed that left a sonic wake across the waterfront. Their eyes followed the displacement rather than the intent, and that hesitation cost them. I struck the flanker with a rising elbow that did not shatter bone, but redistributed his balance into a trajectory that would take him through a shipping crane. The collapse that followed sent containers into the harbor, each impact translating into a wave that would later flood the lower docks with saltwater and debris. Omni-Man caught the worst of it, diverting the crane's fall with a single hand while tracking me with the other, and the concern that had replaced his curiosity deepened by a degree. He was beginning to understand that technique would force him to spend more than he preferred. He tried diplomacy again, not with words but with position, placing himself where my next move would require me to cross a line he had drawn between us and the evacuation corridor forming along the river. It was an attempt to make the city my responsibility, to bind my pride to consequences I had not created. I recognized the tactic because it is one Saiyans once used on weaker worlds. Shift the moral burden onto the challenger and watch them hesitate. I did not hesitate. My Kai flared for the first time in a way they could not dismiss as atmospheric distortion, a controlled expansion that pressed the air outward and forced both Viltrumites to adjust their footing. I did not transform. Spectacle remains a crutch for those who need witnesses. Instead, I launched a pair of blasts tuned to disrupt rather than destroy, striking their center mass in rapid succession to test regenerative thresholds. They endured in a way that would have impressed a lesser warrior, their tissues knitting even as they drove forward with renewed intent. The second irreversible escalation arrived when one of them chose to meet my blast with a charge that ignored the fuel depot behind him. The impact ruptured a storage tank already weakened by Part 1's collapse, and the resulting detonation rolled across the harbor in a pressure wave that snapped moorings and shattered glass for blocks inland. Omni-Man swore under his breath, a small, human habit that betrayed the tactical assessment now dominating his thoughts, and he moved to stabilize a ferry that had begun to list toward the blast. The military drones above interpreted the explosion as hostile escalation and adjusted their engagement parameters accordingly. From orbit, Cecil Stedman authorized a containment response that did not differentiate between alien threats and the infrastructure they occupied. Omni-Man heard the authorization through channels he did not acknowledge publicly, and the realization that his attempt at diplomatic dominance had triggered state-level intervention tightened his jaw. He lunged then with a seriousness that had not been present before, his strike aimed not to test, but to end the exchange before it could spiral further. I met him in base, because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation, and the collision that followed carved a trench through the dockside that would fill with water within the hour. He adapted faster now, learning the rhythm of my feints and timing his counters to force me into positions where civilian structures would absorb the miss. It was clever in a way that earned irritation rather than respect, and irritation is the first step toward competitive focus. The sirens changed pitch as evacuation became evacuation under fire, and the drones began marking both of us as primary threats. Omni-Man's concern hardened into something strategic, and for the first time since my arrival, he considered retreat not as defeat but as repositioning. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I smiled because escalation had finally begun to interest me. By the time Omni-Man adjusted his stance for what he believed would be a decisive exchange, The city had already moved past treating this as an isolated superhuman incident and into the colder language of asset protection. I could feel it in the sky before I saw it, the shift in drone formation from observation to pattern control, their flight paths tightening into a grid that suggested pre-authorization rather than improvisation. This world did not rely solely on capes and fists. It relied on systems designed to react when heroes failed to contain variables like me. Cecil Stedman's response had arrived without ceremony. The first corporate intervention came from the Global Defense Agency's satellite network, a lattice of targeting protocols that interpreted our movements as vectors to be managed rather than personalities to be negotiated with. Omni-Man heard the activation through a channel he kept separate from the one he used to play savior, and I watched the tactical assessment in his eyes sharpen as he understood what would follow. He moved to disengage with a precision that suggested experience, angling our clash away from the densest infrastructure in an attempt to keep the response focused on us rather than the city. It was a clever pivot, and it told me that diplomacy had given way to damage control. I did not follow the pivot because allowing him to define the battlefield would have implied consent to his hierarchy, and instead I widened my Kai output just enough to disrupt the drones' predictive models. Their targeting reticles flickered as they recalculated trajectories that no longer matched expected patterns, and the delay forced them into a secondary protocol that escalated without discrimination. The first kinetic rod fell into the harbor not as an attack on me, but as a stabilizing strike intended to disperse the wake our earlier collision had created. The water obeyed physics rather than intention, surging into a dockyard already weakened by Part 2's detonation. Omni-Man reacted with visible irritation, catching a shipping container that had begun to slide toward an evacuation route while tracking my position with peripheral vision. He understood immediately that the GDA's response would not distinguish between Viltrumite assets and rogue combatants, and that their attempt at containment might force him into cooperation with me by default. I saw the calculation pass through him because it mirrored something familiar, the moment when a warrior realizes the battlefield has grown beyond his preferred scale. He did not ask for my help. He assumed I would resist. Another Viltrumite misread the intervention as an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, charging through the shockwave of the rod's impact to reach me before the drones could adjust again. His strike carried the full weight of endurance rather than finesse, and it landed against my guard with a force that would have flattened lesser opponents. I absorbed it with irritation rather than pain, redirecting his momentum into a spin that sent him through a communications tower the GDA had just deployed. The collapse severed their uplink for a fraction of a second. That fraction was enough for Cecil to authorize the next layer, a network of suppression fields designed to dampen energy signatures above a defined threshold. Omni-Man felt the drag as it engaged, his movements losing the marginal acceleration that had kept pace with my base form. I recognized the intent immediately, because it was the sort of tool one uses against opponents who rely on spectacle rather than discipline. My Kai responded by compressing rather than flaring, a controlled contraction that slipped beneath the field's tolerance and preserved my speed. The second irreversible escalation came when the suppression grid misinterpreted my contraction as a surge and intensified across the entire waterfront. Power conduits beneath the district overloaded in response, their insulation failing under a load they had never been designed to carry. The resulting blackout swallowed an evacuation corridor the GDA had just cleared, and the ambulances within it lost both signal and propulsion. Omni-Man heard the reports as he caught a falling crane for the second time that day, and the concern that had replaced his curiosity deepened into something closer to strategic alarm. He turned toward me with an expression that acknowledged the new reality, that this was no longer a contest between warriors, but a conflict that would draw in every system this planet possessed. I answered with motion rather than rhetoric, stepping forward through the drag of the suppression field to test how quickly their technology would adapt. The drones above shifted formation again, their algorithms learning in real time that brute durability was not the only metric that mattered. Cecil's voice cut through a channel I did not need to hear to understand, ordering a full lockdown of the district as military assets rerouted from offshore carriers. Omniman's posture tightened as he realized retreat would now be interpreted as surrender by both his own people and the agency tasked with defending this world. I recognized the bind because pride makes cages out of options, and the city below us began to pay for that recognition in darkness. By the time the suppression grid settled into its new tolerance, the conflict had already escaped the waterfront and begun threading itself through the rest of the city like a fractured line that did not intend to stop at district borders. I could feel the redistribution before the reports reached Omni-Man, the way emergency sirens shifted from clustered urgency to scattered alarm as infrastructure failed in non-adjacent zones. This was no longer a localized clash between Viltrumite pride and Saiyan contempt. It had become a city-wide stress test for systems that had never been designed to accommodate either of us. Omni-Man understood the expansion as he tracked the drone grid tightening over residential sectors. Cecil's directive reached the GDA's urban response units with a clarity that did not invite debate, authorizing the deployment of containment teams into neighborhoods that had not yet seen the sky crack open. Their armored transports rolled through intersections still choked with evacuation traffic, pushing civilians toward routes that would soon be reclassified as unsafe. I watched the choreography with a detached interest, because it mirrored the sort of planetary pacification Saiyans once performed, order imposed through movement rather than consent. Omni-Man adjusted his position again, attempting to shepherd our exchange toward an industrial zone where collateral would translate into lost inventory rather than lost lives. I let him try, because allowing an opponent to commit to a strategy reveals how they expect the fight to unfold. He accelerated along a vector that would carry us across a transit hub already operating beyond capacity, and for a moment the city held its breath as two incompatible speeds intersected above commuter lines. I matched his pace in base form, stepping through the suppression drag with a precision that left the drones scrambling to update their models. The sonic wake that followed shattered station glass and forced a train into an emergency halt that would strand passengers in tunnels for hours. Another Viltrumite joined from altitude, interpreting Omni-Man's repositioning as a signal to compress the battlefield further. Their formation shifted into a pincer that would have trapped a less disciplined fighter between brute force and infrastructure, and the first strike came down through the roof of a parking structure the GDA had designated as a triage point. The collapse that followed buried medical equipment beneath concrete that would not be cleared before nightfall. Omni-Man's concern hardened into something tactical as he diverted to catch a falling support beam. My response was irritation rather than surprise, because their reliance on endurance had become predictable. I stepped through the pincer with a burst of speed that neither expected, striking the newcomer with a sequence tuned to disrupt balance rather than fracture bone. He endured in the way Viltrumites do, tissues knitting even as he plowed through a line of emergency vehicles that had been rerouted minutes earlier. The chain reaction that followed ignited a fuel spill, and the resulting fire began to climb the facade of an apartment block still awaiting evacuation. The irreversible escalation arrived when the GDA interpreted the apartment fire as evidence that suppression alone would not suffice. Cecil authorized aerial bombardment of structural weak points around the block to create a fire break, a decision that treated the building as expendable in the face of broader risk. The first strike sheared through the lower floors, collapsing them inward and sending a plume of dust across streets that had not yet been cleared. Omni-Man swore again, quieter this time, and moved to stabilize the upper levels before they could follow. I watched the trade unfold because it confirmed what I had already judged. This world would sacrifice parts of itself to contain a threat it could not refine. Omniman's attempt at diplomatic dominance had given way to cooperation with systems he did not control, and that cooperation now demanded losses he could not prevent. He turned toward me with a focus that had moved beyond concern into competitive resolve, because pride does not tolerate being outmaneuvered by committees. I met his gaze and widened my stance, letting my Kai hum beneath the suppression field in a way that promised further escalation without yet delivering it. The city's power grid flickered under the strain of bombardment and suppression combined, and the drones above began marking entire districts as potential engagement zones. Omni-Man recalculated, his curiosity fully replaced by strategic intent, and the realization that retreat would now invite greater destruction tightened his jaw. The conflict had expanded beyond any corridor he could draw, and the next exchange would carve through whatever remained. By the time the apartment block's upper floors settled into the void the GDA had carved beneath them, the response had moved past containment and into outright military escalation. I could feel the change before the aircraft broke cloud cover, the way the suppression field began to synchronize with a new signal that treated our positions as coordinates for ordnance rather than variables to be studied. Omni-Man recognized it as well, his posture shifting from shepherd to shield as he angled himself between the incoming flight path and the evacuation routes that had not yet collapsed. This was no longer about isolating a rogue alien, it was about controlling a battlefield. The first wave did not target us directly, which would have been tactically foolish given the suppression grid's interference. Instead, they struck infrastructure ahead of our projected trajectories, collapsing overpasses and severing transit lines to create artificial choke points that might slow our movement through the city. The result was immediate and irreversible, because evacuation corridors that had been functional minutes earlier became dead ends lined with stalled vehicles. Omni-Man heard the civilian distress call spike, as his attempt to reposition us intersected with a newly fallen span. He diverted to catch the largest section before it could crush a convoy, and I used the opening to test the synchronization between suppression and ordnance. My Kai flared just enough to distort the grid's predictive model, forcing the next strike to land a block off its intended target. The blast cratered a hospital parking structure instead of an empty warehouse, and the ambulances within were lost beneath concrete that would not be cleared before dawn. Omni-Man's concern deepened into strategic alarm, as he realized the military would accept such losses to constrain us. Another Viltrumite misread the escalation as permission to demonstrate dominance, launching himself through the smoke toward me with a charge that ignored the artillery arc above him. His strike carried the full weight of endurance rather than finesse, and it landed against my guard with a force that would have flattened lesser opponents. I absorbed it and redirected his momentum into a fuel tanker the GDA had positioned as a barrier, and the rupture that followed turned the street into a river of fire. The ignition spread toward a school still awaiting evacuation. Cecil authorized heavier assets then, interpreting the tanker's detonation as evidence that suppression and infrastructure denial would not suffice. Omni-Man heard the order and tightened his formation around the nearest civilian cluster, because retreat would now invite bombardment without discrimination. He lunged at me with a seriousness that acknowledged the new stakes, his strike aimed to end the exchange before the next wave could recalibrate. I met him in base, because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation. The collision carved a trench through an industrial park that had been designated as a fallback zone, and the resulting shockwave toppled communications towers the GDA relied upon for drone coordination. Their uplink faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that gap the next barrage lost its lock entirely. The bombs fell into a residential block instead, collapsing homes that had not yet received evacuation orders. Omni-Man's jaw tightened as he caught a falling roof with one hand, while tracking me with the other. The irreversible escalation arrived when the military interpreted the communications failure as hostile interference, and authorized a saturation strike across the district. The suppression grid intensified in response, dragging against my movements in a way that would have hindered a less disciplined fighter. I compressed my Kai beneath its tolerance again, preserving speed while Omni-Man endured the same drag with visible effort. He was adapting tactically now, timing his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The sirens changed pitch as evacuation became evacuation under bombardment, and the Viltrumites around us shifted from curiosity to concern. Omniman's strategic assessment had replaced his initial diplomatic dominance entirely, and for the first time since my arrival he considered that cooperation with the GDA might cost him more than resistance. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I smiled because escalation had finally begun to interest me in earnest. The next wave was already inbound. By the time the next wave of aircraft rotated into position above the cloud layer, this conflict had already been elevated beyond anything the Global Defense Agency was designed to solve locally. I could feel it in the atmosphere before Omni-Man confirmed it through the channel he thought I could not hear. The subtle shift in command authority as this world's governments reclassified our presence from an urban threat into a planetary variable. That reclassification mattered, because it meant the response would no longer prioritize the survival of individual districts so much as the preservation of systems that extended beyond this continent. Omni-Man understood the implication immediately as the strike pattern widened to include zones he had previously steered us away from. The first global response arrived in orbit rather than through the clouds, a network of weapons platforms activating in sequence to project targeting solutions that did not depend on local drone telemetry. Cecil had escalated the incident beyond his own agency's jurisdiction, and now the committee that governed this planet's defensive posture had authorized assets that were never meant to be used over population centers. Omni-Man's posture shifted again, from shield to strategist, because he recognized that retreat would now be interpreted as surrender by both his empire and this world's defenders. I saw the calculation pass through him as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. They did not strike us directly at first, which would have been inefficient given the suppression grid still distorting predictive models around my Kai signature. Instead, the orbital platforms targeted infrastructure nodes ahead of our projected trajectories, collapsing power relays and transit junctions to create artificial voids in the city's movement patterns. The effect was immediate and irreversible, because evacuation corridors that had been functional minutes earlier became choke points lined with stalled vehicles and panicked responders. Omni-Man diverted to stabilize a bridge, whose supports had just been severed by a kinetic rod, catching the central span before it could drop into a canal already swollen from earlier blasts. I moved while his attention was divided, stepping through the drag of the suppression field to test how quickly the orbital systems would adapt to my displacement. Their algorithms updated within seconds, redirecting the next strike toward the industrial zone he had been attempting to steer me into since Part 4. The rod landed where a refinery had been nursing pressure imbalances since the initial clash, and the detonation that followed rolled across 3 districts in a shockwave that snapped gas mains and shattered glass for blocks inland. Omni-Man swore again, quieter this time, and moved to catch a storage tank that had begun to list toward an evacuation route. Another Viltrumite joined from altitude, interpreting the global escalation as confirmation that this world had accepted us as an existential threat. His charge ignored the artillery arc above him, and his strike carried the full weight of endurance rather than finesse. I absorbed it with irritation rather than pain, redirecting his momentum into a communications hub the GDA had just reactivated to coordinate relief efforts. The collapse severed their uplink for a fraction of a second, and in that gap, the next orbital strike lost its lock entirely. The irreversible escalation arrived when the rod fell into a residential block, instead of the empty warehouse it had been assigned. Homes that had not yet received evacuation orders collapsed inward, and the resulting dust plume swallowed an emergency convoy, attempting to reach a hospital still operating on backup power. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as he caught the falling hub with one hand while tracking my position with the other, and the concern that had replaced his curiosity deepened into strategic alarm. He realized that cooperation with the GDA had now bound him to a response that would accept civilian loss as a necessary trade. Cecil authorized the deployment of suppression satellites to reinforce the grid already dragging against my movements, their combined output designed to compress my Chi signature into a range the orbital platforms could predict. I recognized the intent immediately and responded by contracting rather than flaring, slipping beneath their tolerance in a way that preserved my speed, while Omni-Man endured the same drag with visible effort. He was adapting tactically now, timing his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The sirens changed pitch again, as evacuation became evacuation under orbital fire, and the Viltrumites around us shifted from irritation to concern. Omni-Man's strategic assessment had replaced his initial diplomatic dominance entirely, and for the first time since my arrival, he considered retreat not as defeat but as repositioning. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I welcomed the shift because escalation had finally begun to resemble a real contest. The next strike pattern was already being drawn across the hemisphere. By the time the new strike pattern propagated across the orbital lattice, this had stopped resembling a territorial dispute and started looking like a trial run for planetary defense against a threat no one had planned to quantify. I could feel the change in the suppression grid before Omni-Man acknowledged it, the way its drag shifted from broad interference to targeted resistance along my projected vectors. They were learning, and learning always deserves a response. Omni-Man repositioned with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had moved beyond containment into a test of endurance versus technique. I moved first because allowing him to dictate tempo would have suggested parity, and parity is a courtesy I do not extend. My approach was measured rather than spectacular, a sequence of feints that forced him to commit to counters before he understood their purpose. He adapted with a durability that remained impressive in its own right, absorbing impacts that would have crippled lesser fighters and returning force with a bluntness that carved a trench through the industrial park below us. The difference between us had become clearer now. His strength was enormous, but it lacked the refinement that turns raw power into inevitability. Another Viltrumite joined from the flank, interpreting my continued base-form engagement as evidence that I had reached a limit rather than a choice. Their formation compressed into a wedge that would have trapped a less disciplined opponent between brute force and the suppression drag now thickening the air. I stepped through it with a burst of speed that left the orbital algorithm scrambling to update, striking the newcomer with a rising knee that redistributed his balance into a trajectory toward a cargo yard. The containers there toppled into the harbor, each impact translating into waves that would later flood the lower docks with debris. Omni-Man caught the worst of it with a single arm while tracking me with the other, and the concern that had replaced his curiosity deepened by another degree. He was beginning to understand that endurance alone would not secure dominance against technique, and that realization shifted his tactical approach. Instead of meeting my strikes head-on, he began timing his counters to coincide with orbital bombardment windows, forcing me into positions where the next rod would land within lethal proximity. It was clever in a way that earned irritation rather than respect. I answered by widening my Chi output just enough to disrupt the synchronization between suppression and ordnance, a controlled flare that pressed the air outward and forced both Viltrumites to adjust their footing. The orbital platforms interpreted the surge as an escalation and intensified their targeting, redirecting the next strike toward the refinery district he had been steering us away from since Part 5. The rod landed where a storage tank had been weakened by earlier blasts, and the detonation that followed rolled across 3 districts in a shockwave that snapped moorings and shattered glass inland. The irreversible escalation arrived when one of the Viltrumites chose to charge through the blast to reach me before the drones could recalibrate. His strike carried the full weight of their regenerative endurance, and it landed against my guard with a force that would have flattened lesser opponents. I absorbed it with irritation rather than pain, redirecting his momentum into a communications tower the GDA had just deployed. The collapse severed their uplink for a fraction of a second, and in that gap, the next orbital strike lost its lock entirely. The rod fell into a hospital parking structure instead of the empty warehouse it had been assigned, collapsing ambulances beneath concrete that would not be cleared before dawn. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as he caught the falling tower with one hand while tracking my position with the other, and the strategic alarm in his expression hardened into resolve. He lunged with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had become a matter of survival rather than dominance. I met him in base because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation, and the collision that followed carved a channel through the dockside that would fill with water within the hour. He adapted faster now, learning the rhythm of my feints and timing his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The suppression grid intensified in response, dragging against my movements in a way that would have hindered a less disciplined fighter. The sirens changed pitch again as evacuation became evacuation under orbital fire, and the Viltrumites around us shifted from concern to something closer to respect. Omni-Man's strategic assessment had replaced his initial diplomatic dominance entirely, and for the first time since my arrival he considered that resistance might require escalation beyond endurance alone. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I welcomed the shift because dominance is proven only when resistance learns to adapt. The next exchange would decide who controlled the tempo. By the time the orbital lattice completed its latest recalibration, Omni-Man had already abandoned any pretense that this could be solved through containment alone. I could see it in the way he stopped attempting to steer me toward expendable zones, and instead began drawing me into trajectories that would intersect with Viltrumite reinforcements now entering the atmosphere. That shift mattered, because it meant he had decided endurance would no longer be enough. Adaptation would have to become their answer to technique. I welcomed the change because it promised a fight that might finally demand more than irritation. The first reinforcement arrived without ceremony, a Viltrumite whose approach vector ignored the suppression drag entirely by exploiting gaps in the orbital grid's predictive model. His strike came from below rather than above, a rising blow that carried the full weight of regenerative muscle rather than refined timing. I absorbed it with a guard that redirected his momentum into a spiral, sending him through a row of cranes the GDA had just deployed to clear evacuation routes. The collapse severed their cables and dropped shipping containers into the harbor, each impact translating into waves that would later flood the lower docks. Omni-Man moved to catch the worst of it while tracking me with peripheral vision, and I recognized the tactical awareness that had replaced his earlier curiosity. He was learning now, not from doctrine but from direct contact, adjusting his counters to exploit the moments when my Kai flared to disrupt suppression. Instead of meeting my strikes head-on, he began timing his advances to coincide with orbital bombardment windows, forcing me into positions where the next rod would land within lethal proximity. It was an adaptive counteroffensive born of necessity rather than pride. I answered by compressing my energy beneath the grid's tolerance, slipping through its drag in a burst of speed that left the orbital algorithm scrambling to update. My strike landed against the newcomer's sternum with a precision that redistributed his balance into a trajectory toward a fuel depot already weakened by Part 6's detonation. The rupture that followed turned the street into a river of fire, and the ignition spread toward a school still awaiting evacuation. Omni-Man swore again, quieter this time, and diverted to catch a falling support beam before it could crush the entrance. Another Viltrumite joined from altitude, interpreting my continued base form engagement as evidence that I had reached a limit rather than a choice. Their formation shifted into a triangle that would have trapped a less disciplined fighter between brute force and infrastructure. I stepped through the pressure long enough to measure their coordination before breaking out with a lateral burst that carved a trench through the dockside. The resulting shockwave toppled communications, towers the GDA relied upon for drone coordination. The irreversible escalation arrived when the next orbital strike lost its lock entirely and fell into a residential block instead of the empty warehouse it had been assigned. Homes that had not yet received evacuation orders collapsed inward, and the resulting dust plume swallowed an emergency convoy attempting to reach a hospital still operating on backup power. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as he caught the falling tower with one hand while tracking me with the other, and the strategic alarm in his expression hardened into resolve. He lunged with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had become a matter of survival rather than dominance. His strike aimed to end the exchange before the orbital lattice could recalibrate again. I met him in base because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation, and the collision that followed carved a channel through the industrial park that would fill with water within the hour. He adapted faster now, learning the rhythm of my feints and timing his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The suppression grid intensified in response, dragging against my movements in a way that would have hindered a less disciplined fighter. I compressed my Kai further, preserving speed while Omni-Man endured the same drag with visible effort. The Viltrumites around us shifted from irritation to something closer to respect, their endurance now paired with tactical adjustment. Cecil's voice cut through the channel with an authorization for a final orbital barrage, and the realization that this would not end without planetary consequence settled into Omni-Man's posture. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I welcomed the shift because resistance had finally begun to resemble a challenge. The barrage was already inbound. The barrage did not arrive as a single solution, but as a coordinated insistence that this conflict would now be measured against planetary tolerance rather than urban survival. I could feel the atmosphere tighten before the first rod breached the cloud layer, the way the suppression grid synchronized with orbital targeting to treat my movements as seismic rather than personal. Omni-Man recognized it as well, his posture shifting from adaptive resistance into something that bordered on desperation as he angled our clash away from the densest population centers. This was no longer about preserving infrastructure. It was about preventing extinction-level consequences. The first strike landed where the industrial trench from Part 8 had already compromised the ground, its impact translating into a shockwave that propagated along fault lines beneath the city. Buildings that had survived bombardment began to list as their foundations shifted by millimeters that would become meters within the hour. Omni-Man diverted to stabilize a tower that had become a temporary triage center, catching its upper floors before they could shear away. I moved through the suppression drag to test how quickly the lattice would adapt to my displacement. Another Viltrumite joined from altitude, interpreting the global barrage as confirmation that endurance alone would not suffice. His charge came from behind Omni-Man, a coordinated attempt to compress my movement into the path of the next strike. Their formation had improved since Part 7, brute force now paired with tactical awareness that forced me to commit more than irritation to break it. I answered by widening my Kai output just enough to disrupt the synchronization between suppression and ordnance, a controlled flare that pressed the air outward and forced both to adjust their footing. The orbital platforms interpreted the surge as escalation and intensified their targeting, redirecting the next rod toward the harbor district Omni-Man had been steering us away from since Part 5. The impact flattened the water into a mirror for a fraction of a second before the displaced mass surged inland through drainage canals weakened by earlier blasts. Omni-Man heard the reports as he caught a falling communications mast with one hand, and the strategic alarm in his expression deepened into something closer to acceptance. I recognized the threshold immediately because the suppression grid began to strain against my contracted energy in a way it had not before. Their systems were learning to treat Kai as a variable rather than noise, and that demanded a response that would finally justify my irritation. I did not transform. Instead, I allowed my output to rise into a range that would slip the grid's tolerance entirely. The air around us compressed into a medium that treated sound as an afterthought. The irreversible escalation arrived when the next orbital strike lost its lock and fell into a transit hub still serving as an evacuation point. The collapse buried responders beneath concrete that would not be cleared before nightfall, and the resulting dust plume swallowed a convoy attempting to reach higher ground. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as he tracked my position with peripheral vision, and the realization that his cooperation with the GDA had bound him to this outcome tightened his jaw. He lunged then with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had become a matter of survival rather than dominance. His strike aimed to end the exchange before the barrage could recalibrate again. I met him in base because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation, and the collision that followed carved a channel through the dockside that would fill with water within the hour. He adapted faster now, timing his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The suppression grid intensified in response, dragging against my movements in a way that would have hindered a less disciplined fighter. I compressed my Kai further, preserving speed while Omni-Man endured the same drag with visible effort. The Viltrumites around us shifted from irritation to respect, their endurance now paired with tactical adjustment that threatened to close the gap between us. The barrage pattern expanded beyond the city limits. By the time the barrage pattern expanded beyond the city limits, this conflict had already begun rewriting coastlines in ways no one would be able to correct with reconstruction budgets or memorials. I could feel the ground responding before Omni-Man acknowledged it, the way fault lines awakened beneath districts that had not yet seen direct impact. This was the moment where planetary tolerance stopped being theoretical and became something measured in permanent loss. Omni-Man's posture shifted from strategist into something heavier, because he understood that every further exchange would now translate into geography. The first irreversible failure surfaced along the harbor where the trench from Part 8 had intersected with the transit collapse from Part 9. The orbital strike intended to stabilize the shoreline instead destabilized a retaining wall already compromised by earlier detonations. Water surged through the breach with a patience that suggested inevitability, filling streets that had been cleared minutes before. Omni-Man heard the evacuation routes dissolve, as responders reported flooding in sectors previously marked safe. He broke from me to brace the nearest bridge before it could tip into the rising water, because that is what he always chose when forced to trade dominance for survival. The effort cost him position, and I moved through the suppression drag to test how quickly their barrage would adapt to my displacement. Another Viltrumite misread the opening as permission to press, charging with the full weight of regenerative muscle rather than refined timing. His strike landed against my guard with a force that would have flattened lesser opponents, and I redirected his momentum into a fuel depot the GDA had designated expendable. The rupture that followed turned the street into a river of fire, and the ignition spread toward a hospital still operating on backup power. Omni-Man saw it as he stabilized the bridge, and the realization that his cooperation with the barrage had bound him to this outcome settled into something that bordered on anger. He lunged back toward me with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had become a matter of survival rather than pride. I met him in base because I would not dignify brute insistence with immediate transformation, and the collision carved a channel through the industrial park that would fill with water within the hour. The suppression grid intensified in response, dragging against my movements in a way that would have hindered a less disciplined fighter. I compressed my Kai further, preserving speed while Omni-Man endured the same drag with visible effort. The irreversible loss arrived when the next orbital strike miscalculated under the interference of my contraction and fell into the financial district's power hub instead of the empty lot assigned. The detonation severed the last functioning conduit feeding emergency services across 3 boroughs, and the blackout that followed swallowed hospitals, transit hubs, and evacuation centers in a darkness that would not lift before morning. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as he caught a falling communications mast with one hand while tracking me with the other. He did not retreat because retreat would now invite greater destruction under a barrage that could no longer distinguish between targets. Instead, he pressed forward, adapting his counters to force me into positions where the next strike would land close enough to matter. The Viltrumites around us shifted from respect into resolve, their endurance now paired with tactical adjustment that threatened to close the gap between us. Cecil's authorization for a final barrage transmitted across a grid already failing under its own output, and the realization that this would not end without planetary consequence settled into Omni-Man's posture. I saw it in the angle of his shoulders as he recalculated, and I welcomed the shift because loss had finally made this contest worth finishing. The shoreline was already moving. By the time the shoreline began to move in ways that no civil engineer could model, Omni-Man had already abandoned the fiction that this planet's systems would contain what had been set in motion. I could feel the shift beneath my feet before the reports reached him, the way the bedrock itself responded to orbital bombardment that had exceeded any tolerances written into its design. This was no longer a question of whether cities would survive. It was a question of whether Dominion, Viltrumite or otherwise, could exist on a world whose geography had been rewritten mid-conflict. Omni-Man understood that before the committee did. The barrage pattern tightened around our last known vectors, orbital platforms committing the remainder of their operational lifespan to a strike sequence that would force resolution rather than delay. I watched the sky grow brighter with reflected fire as rods descended into districts already emptied by evacuation orders that had arrived too late to matter. Omni-Man, repositioned with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest, had moved beyond tactical assessment into existential trade. He was no longer attempting to shepherd me away from population centers. He was attempting to keep the planet from tearing itself apart around us. Another Viltrumite arrived from altitude, drawn by the scale of the conflict and the promise of a threat worth engaging directly. Their formation shifted into something approaching discipline, endurance now paired with coordination that had been absent in Part 1. They pressed from multiple vectors, forcing me to divide my attention between brute force and the suppression drag that had grown thicker with each orbital adjustment. I welcomed the pressure, because resistance had finally begun to resemble challenge. I answered by widening my Kai output beyond the grid's tolerance for the first time since my arrival, not as spectacle but as necessity. The air compressed into a medium that treated motion as frictionless, while the suppression field struggled to reconcile a signature it had been taught to dampen rather than contain. Omni-Man felt the shift immediately as his own movements lost the marginal acceleration he had relied upon since Part 7. He adapted by timing his counters to coincide with the barrage's impact windows, forcing me into positions where the next strike would land within lethal proximity. The first irreversible collapse surfaced beneath the transit tunnels that had survived earlier detonations, their supports shearing as fault lines completed the slip initiated in Part 5. Water from the harbor surged through the breach, filling corridors that had served as evacuation routes hours before. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike as responders reported flooding in sectors previously marked safe, and the strategic alarm in his expression hardened into acceptance. He broke from me, to brace a tunnel entrance before it could seal itself with debris. That break was the cost. I moved through the suppression drag to test how quickly the barrage would adapt to my displacement, stepping into a vector that forced the next rod to recalibrate mid-descent. The strike intended for an empty industrial zone, instead, impacted a communications hub coordinating global relief efforts. The detonation severed uplinks across 3 continents, isolating response teams that had relied on orbital telemetry to navigate the new coastline. Omniman saw the reports as he caught a falling support beam with one hand, and the realization that cooperation with this world's defenses had bound him to irreversible loss settled into his posture. He lunged back toward me with a seriousness that acknowledged the contest had become a matter of planetary survival rather than pride. I met him in Super Saiyan for the first time, because base form would no longer suffice against an opponent adapting under existential pressure. The transformation was not theatrical. It was a controlled escalation that forced the suppression grid to recalibrate entirely. The collision that followed carved a channel through bedrock that would fill with water within minutes. The Viltrumites endured, their regeneration knitting damage even as they pressed forward with renewed coordination. Omni-Man adapted again, exploiting the momentary drag as the grid struggled to dampen my new output. His strike forced me into the path of the next barrage window, and for a second that mattered, the orbital lattice achieved lock. The rod fell toward a power relay that had been feeding emergency services across the hemisphere. The irreversible loss arrived when my counter redirected its trajectory into the continental shelf instead. The impact did not produce a crater so much as a fracture that ran for kilometers beneath the ocean floor, and the resulting displacement translated into a wave that would reach coastlines hours from now. Omni-Man felt it as the ground beneath us settled into a new agreement with gravity, and the dominion he had been sent to establish slipped beyond his reach in that moment. This world would not belong to anyone after today. The ocean was already rising. The ocean did not rise in anger, it rose in obedience. The fracture I carved through the continental shelf did not explode outward in spectacle. It shifted, and that shift translated through water with a patience that made the destruction more certain rather than less. I felt the displacement before satellites confirmed it, the way the planet recalibrated its own weight distribution in response to a strike that had exceeded the tolerance of crust and committee alike. Omni-Man felt it too, because his posture changed from combatant to something older, a soldier watching a campaign slip beyond strategy. The first wave struck the nearest coastline within minutes, swallowing districts that had already been destabilized by bombardment. Sea walls that had held for decades folded as if they had been decorative rather than structural. The harbor that had been contested ground since Part 1 ceased to be a harbor at all and became open water. Omni-Man heard the distress calls spike into a unified signal of evacuation failure. He did not retreat. He accelerated toward the shoreline to brace what he could, catching a collapsing suspension bridge that would otherwise have become a battering ram against the inland districts. The effort cost him altitude and position, and the remaining Viltrumites followed his lead without hesitation. They were no longer interpreting me as a rogue alien asset to recruit or eliminate. They were recognizing that this conflict had crossed into extinction mathematics. I hovered above the shifting coast and assessed the outcome without confusion. The orbital platforms were failing one by one, their power reserves exhausted by suppression and miscalculation. The barrage had ended not with victory, but with depletion. This world's greatest systems had overcommitted in response to my presence, and now had nothing left to give. Cecil's final directive transmitted through fractured channels, ordering full planetary evacuation protocols for coastal zones. It was too late for half of them. Omni-Man returned to me not with diplomacy and not with dominance, but with clarity. His eyes carried no curiosity now, no attempt at strategic superiority. He understood what had happened. His cooperation with this planet's military had escalated the conflict beyond control, and my refusal to submit had transformed it into something irreversible. The Viltrumite Empire would not inherit this world. It would inherit a crisis. He attacked again, not because he believed he could win, but because a warrior does not allow a force like me to leave unchallenged. I met him in Super Saiyan without ceremony, and the collision that followed split the sky rather than the ground. The shockwave flattened what remained of the industrial district and sent a secondary wave racing across the already destabilized ocean surface. More coastlines would pay for that exchange. The remaining Viltrumites joined, their formation tighter than ever before, endurance now honed by adaptation. They pressed from coordinated vectors designed to overwhelm speed with persistence. I responded by escalating once more, allowing my power to crest beyond the suppression grid's dead remnants. The transformation was not theatrical, it was controlled inevitability. Super Saiyan Blue. The air froze around us, not from temperature but from pressure. Omni-Man felt it immediately. His endurance met a threshold it had not been designed to cross. My strikes no longer redistributed momentum, they terminated it. One Viltrumite fell into the ocean below, his regeneration insufficient against the velocity of impact. Another was driven through bedrock that would soon lie beneath permanent water. Omni-Man endured longer than the others. He adapted even as the gap widened, timing counters with the precision of a seasoned general rather than a brute conqueror. For a moment that mattered, he forced me backward across open water, and the ocean split beneath us from the pressure of exchange. But adaptation is not ascension. I ended it with a final, controlled blast that did not scatter across the planet but concentrated into a singular conclusion. The impact drove him through the collapsing skyline of what had once been a city center, embedding him beneath concrete that would never again stand above sea level. He did not die. Viltrumites rarely do so easily, but he was finished. The surviving members of his kind withdrew without command. Retreat was no longer tactical, it was survival. The ocean continued to rise. By nightfall, 3 coastal cities were partially submerged. Fault lines activated by orbital overreach would reshape shorelines for decades. The GDA's orbital network was gone. Global communications were fragmented. Entire regions would be rebuilt inland or not at all. The Viltrumite Empire recalculated its expansion strategy that same day. This planet was no longer a candidate for clean conquest. It had become unstable territory, a world proven capable of destroying itself when pressed by powers it could not contain. I hovered above the new coastline and considered whether this universe held further challenges worth my time. Pride had been satisfied, but satisfaction is not permanence. The damage here would ripple for generations. Viltrumite ambitions would return eventually, perhaps with greater force, perhaps with better discipline. But they would return knowing that brute endurance is not supremacy. The world did not return to normal. Its maps changed. Its oceans claimed new borders. Its defenders lost their certainty. And its conquerors lost their illusion of inevitability.